Band of Brothers captured the chaos of the airborne invasion of Normandy, but time only allowed the series to briefly show Lieutenant Richard Winters jumping safely into the dark French countryside. Pat Christenson was aboard the same aircraft as Lieutenant Winters. Winters stood in the open doorway of the plane, staring out as the coastline of France slowly grew larger in the distance. Pat stood directly behind him, second in line to jump. For a while the flight was eerily quiet. Then a few miles after crossing the peninsula, Winters pointed toward the aircraft flying ahead of them and said, "Look, Chris, they're really catching hell up there." Pat later wrote that bright red and orange tracer rounds stretched through the night sky toward the lead planes. The tension in the aircraft rose quickly, nerves tightening with every passing second. A sudden burst of flak exploded off their right side, jolting the men who had been staring silently out into the darkness during the long flight. Now everyone was wide awake. It was clear the drop zone couldn't be far away. The anti-aircraft fire grew heavier. The men stood ready, anxious to get the hell out of the swaying aircraft, while the pilot did everything he could to dodge the incoming fire. The sky around them erupted as anti-aircraft guns hammered relentlessly. Then it was time. The green light flashed on. Go, go, go! As Winters leapt from the plane, a violent burst of 20mm fire slammed into the tail section. For a split second, Pat thought Winters had jumped straight into the explosion. A second later, Pat threw himself out the door after him. The violent shock of the parachute opening ripped away much of Pat's equipment, just as it did for many of the men that night. The pilots had been flying far too fast and dangerously low. Pat was a machine gunner and had been carrying a heavy machine gun tripod. It was torn away from him during the jump, along with his carbine, his ammunition, and his musette bag. While descending through the darkness, a German machine gun swept across the sky, firing long bursts directly through the 18 men who had jumped in his stick. Adrenaline surged through Pat's body as explosions echoed all around him. Off to his right, about 150 feet away, a C-47's engine was burning. The aircraft looked as though it was breaking apart in midair. Somewhere off to his left, a church bell was ringing wildly in a nearby town. Pat forced himself to think. Keep your composure. Assess the situation. Plan your next move. Christ, I'm heading straight for those trees. I'm coming down too fast. Focus on your landing. Beyond the trees, he could make out an orchard. As he drifted over the treetops, he pulled his legs up to avoid hitting the branches. Then a sudden wave of terror hit him. 70 feet below him, and only about 20 feet to his left, sat a German quad-mounted 20mm anti-aircraft gun. At that exact moment, the gun opened fire at the C-47s roaring overhead. Fortunately, the German gunners were completely focused on the aircraft above them and never looked up to see Pat drifting down almost beside them. It was pure luck. Years later, Pat would tell his nephew that if they had noticed him, they would have fired a burst, and that would have been the end of it. For decades, Pat wondered about the bell he had heard ringing as he descended. It wasn't until he watched the film The Longest Day years later that he realized what it had been. He had landed near the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. All those years he had assumed the Germans were ringing the church bell as an alarm. In reality, it had been the townspeople ringing it because a house near the church had caught fire. Pat's parachute dropped him high into an apple tree. He crashed down the trunk and landed hard in the orchard below. He quickly took stock of what he had left. His only weapon was a .45 caliber revolver he had bought earlier from a British paratrooper for $50. That .45 would stay with him for the rest of the war. He dove into a nearby hedgerow for cover and nearly jumped out of his skin when he stepped on something. It was the body of a dead American pathfinder, a large blond man. The moment Pat stepped on him, the corpse released a deep grunt as air escaped from the man's diaphragm. The sound terrified him. It was a brutal way to begin the war. And the night's events were only just beginning. Pat later wrote that he stayed completely still, barely moving except to slowly turn his head. Then he noticed movement about 40 feet in front of him. A dark silhouette of a helmeted man was crawling toward him on all fours. Pat reached for the small cricket clicker issued to paratroopers for identification. He pressed it once. Click-clack. The signal of a friendly. The figure froze. Pat waited for the proper countersign. Nothing came. The silhouette began crawling toward him again. Pat raised his pistol and aimed directly at the man's chest. Once more, he clicked the cricket. Click-clack. This time the figure immediately raised a hand and whispered urgently, "For Christ's sake, don't shoot." At that moment, Pat knew it wasn't a German. The man was his assistant gunner, Woodrow Robbins. "What the hell's wrong with you?" Pat whispered. "Why didn't you use your cricket?" "I lost the cricket part of the cricket," Robbins stammered. "The piece that makes the sound." It was about 1:50 in the morning. Not long afterward, Pat managed to pick up a German rifle, a Mauser Model 98 bolt action. He would carry and use that weapon during the first few days of the Normandy campaign. Carwood Lipton had been assigned as jumpmaster for stick number 73 after Lieutenant Schmitz was injured during a roughhousing incident with Richard Winters. Before the jump, the pilot allowed Lipton to keep the aircraft door open during the flight. Lipton lay flat on the floor with his head partly outside the plane, believing it would give the men in his stick a better chance of escaping quickly if the aircraft took a hit from flak. He later remembered that most of the paratroopers around him were asleep. They had been ordered to take air sickness pills before boarding, and the medication had knocked many of them out. As their aircraft crossed the English Channel, Lipton looked down and witnessed an incredible sight. An enormous armada of nearly 6,000 ships moving silently toward the Normandy coast under the cover of darkness. When the plane began approaching the drop zone, Lipton had the uneasy feeling that they were flying far too fast and far too low. Moments later, tracer rounds began ripping past the sides of the aircraft. The moment the green light flashed on, Lipton immediately jumped. After landing in a small walled enclosure just outside the town of Saint-Mataglisa, Lipton quickly got his bearings and spotted a road sign identifying the nearby town. Not long after touching down, he encountered 2 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division. Soon afterward, he ran into Dick Winters as well. Lieutenant Harry Welsh had earlier been the officer who told George Luce to switch places with Roy Cobb. Cobb had been carrying the radio, and with all the equipment he was hauling, he weighed a ton. Welsh had the uneasy feeling Cobb might not make it to the door in time when the jump began. As their aircraft approached the drop zone, it suddenly flew into a storm of machine gun tracers and incoming fire. Cobb was struck by bullets and collapsed, unable to stand. Welsh immediately ordered Mike Ranney to unhook Cobb's parachute harness. The men were still waiting for the green jump light when another burst of gunfire tore through the aircraft and destroyed the jump light completely. That was enough for Welsh. He gave the signal to jump. As Welsh leapt from the plane, a C-47 crashed directly below him. The explosion erupted just beneath him, and the blast wave hurled him upward and sideways through the air. Ironically, the force of the explosion likely saved his life. Despite the chaos of the jump, Welsh managed to link up with the rest of the company later that morning.